Developing tonight, attorneys for former Mayor Chokwe Lumumba argue that his bribery case should have been dismissed in part because at least one of the actions was not an official act. Court records unsealed today show that act was making a phone call to then planning director Jai Keaton. It directed Keaton to move up the due date for companies to respond to the city's request for qualifications to oversee the Jackson Convention Center. The argument over the official act was referenced in a response to the government's motion to exclude certain evidence from being introduced at trial. According to his October 2024 indictment, the mayor allegedly received five $10,000 checks from FBI agents posing as developers seeking the contract. Also today, District Attorney Jody Owens filed another motion to dismiss the charges against him. You can find more details about that by scanning the QR code on your screen. You can also follow along our extensive reporting with this case set for trial in July.